Arizona Territory, 1879. The heat hung low over the red dust plains, and the wind carried more than sand, it carried judgment. Viretta Sanders stepped off the wagon with her shawl clutched tight to her chest, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Her boots struck the ground outside the trading post in Agua Verde, and already she could feel the stares. Not because she was a widow, though that had once been cause enough, but because of the man who rode behind her. He was Mescalero Apache. His name was Tahoma, and she had loved him once. People whispered before she even crossed the threshold. Women who used to pass her pies after church now turned their backs. Men spat near her boots as she walked by. It was not just because he was Apache, it was because he was from another tribe than the one her late husband had belonged to. Her husband, Isaac Sanders, had been White Mountain Apache, and the tribal bond had once protected her. But Isaac had died 2 winters ago, and her heart, stubborn as the land itself, had found comfort in Tahoma despite the lines drawn by blood and history. She stood inside the post, jaw tight, as Tahoma disappeared into the back to speak with the trader. She knew what was coming before it happened. "You should be ashamed," hissed a voice behind her. Viretta turned slowly. It was Isaac's cousin, Nanton. He had never liked her, not even when Isaac was alive. He stepped closer, voice low but sharp. "Mixing blood that was never meant to cross. You disgrace your husband's name." Viretta's fingers curled tight around the strap of her satchel. "I loved Isaac. And I did not stop loving him by finding peace with someone else. He is from another tribe. That peace is poison." She did not answer. There was no point. She stepped past him and out into the sun again. The sky burned overhead. Tahoma emerged a few minutes later, his expression unreadable. "They will not trade with me," he said. Viretta nodded. "I know." They rode out in silence, the trail winding toward the low hills. She had nothing left in Agua Verde. Her small house had been sold. Her late husband's people no longer spoke to her. The women had stopped bringing her baskets of herbs or asking after her 2 children, who now stayed with Isaac's mother, confused and quiet. She could not take them with her, not yet. She needed a place first, a future. That night they camped beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The fire cracked low. Tahoma sat across from her, silent, the way he always was. They shared food, but not words. Viretta watched the flames and tried to ignore the ache in her chest. "I do not want you to burn for choosing me," he said finally. "I already have," she whispered. He looked at her then just for a second, and she saw the sorrow in his eyes. She thought about the first time he had spoken to her, months after Isaac's death, when she had brought water to the edge of the reservation and he had been there, quiet, respectful. She had not meant to care for him. But grief had a strange way of bending time, of making the smallest kindness feel like salvation. They did not sleep close, not that night. She lay with her back to the fire, her hand curled over the medallion Isaac had left her. She had not stopped loving him. But she had learned that love, real love, was not about walls. It was about who stayed when the world walked away. The next morning, they made their way toward the mountain pass. Viretta had heard of a rancher up in the high country who sometimes offered work to travelers. They needed money and food and land that would not judge them. The trail narrowed. Rocks slid beneath the hooves of their horses. At midday, a shot cracked through the canyon. Tahoma's horse reared and he fell hard to the dirt. Viretta hit the ground behind him, rolling to her knees just as 3 riders came into view. They wore long dusters and wide hats, hands on the butts of their rifles. "Look what we got here," one of them said, eyes on Tahoma. Apache and a woman with no shame. Viretta stood, hand on her belt knife. "We are just passing through." "I bet you are," the man laughed. "You know what they say about women like you. You take one from another tribe and soon you will take any man that offers." Tahoma pushed himself up, his shoulder bleeding. He did not speak. The leader stepped closer. "You can go on with us now, or we can take you by force." Viretta did not move. Her heart beat so loud she could barely hear. Then, before anyone could speak again, another rider came down the trail from behind the rocks. He was alone, tall in the saddle, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had seen enough to know better than to rush. His horse stopped between Viretta and the men. "I would think twice about touching her," he said calmly, voice low and solid. "Unless you want a bullet in your leg." The 3 men shifted. One of them raised his rifle, but the stranger already had his drawn. "Go," he said. Now they left, spitting curses. When the dust settled, Viretta turned toward the man. He had dark blonde hair, a few days of stubble, and a sun-worn face. His eyes were the color of river stone. "You all right?" he asked. Viretta nodded. "Thank you." He dismounted and helped Tahoma sit against a rock. "Name's Orin Keller. I run the Broken Mesa Ranch, about 2 miles west. You both look like you could use a place to rest." Tahoma looked at Viretta, waiting. She nodded once. "We would be grateful." Orin helped them onto their horses and led the way. The trail climbed, the air cooling with each mile. By the time they reached the ranch, Tahoma's bleeding had slowed, and Viretta could breathe again. The house was small but sturdy, the land open and quiet. Orin offered them water, food, and a spare room in the bunkhouse. That night, after Tahoma had been bandaged and laid to rest, Viretta stood out by the corral, watching the moon rise. "You do not look like a man who scares easy," she said. Orin leaned against the fence beside her. "I do not like men who try to take what is not theirs." She looked at him. "You did not even ask what we were to each other," he shrugged. "Does not matter. Most people think it does." He turned toward her then, his face serious. "Love is all that matters." The words hit her like a warm wind. She had been waiting so long to hear someone say it without judgment, without warning. He tipped his hat. "You are safe here, Viretta." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Orin." She meant it, and for the first time in months she felt something close to hope. The land around Broken Mesa Ranch was dry but alive, with quiet color sagebrush silver under morning light, the rust of canyon stone stretching westward. A breeze shifted the grass near the corral, and Viretta stood beside the pump, sleeves rolled as she worked water into the basin. Her arms ached, not from the labor, but from weeks of holding herself rigid. Tahoma sat nearby, sharpening a blade with even strokes. His wound was healing slowly. He neither complained nor asked for help, and Viretta didn't offer unless he needed it. Their silences had grown longer, not bitter, just worn. They shared understanding, but it no longer filled the space between them the way it once had. Orin approached from the barn, leading a bay mare by the halter. Dust clung to his boots, and his cuffs were rolled from the day's work. He didn't look at her right away, just tied the mare to the post and ran a hand along her flank. "She's favoring the back leg," he said, voice low. "I'd like to rest her a few days. Would you mind keeping an eye on her?" Viretta dipped her hands into the basin, then dried them on her skirt. "I can do that. You've got a way with animals," he added. "They settle near you." "The skittish ones usually do," she said without smiling. He finally looked at her, and something in his gaze held steady. "That why you stayed by Tahoma?" She didn't answer right away. The question wasn't cruel, it wasn't loaded. Just curious and spoken like a man who'd earned the right to ask. "He never needed me to speak when I wasn't ready," she said. That was the first kindness I'd had in a long time. Orin nodded once. "That's something worth staying for." She glanced toward Tahoma. His attention was still on the blade in his lap, the rhythm of the whetstone unbroken. "I used to think love had to look like a grand gesture," she said. "But sometimes, it's just someone sitting beside you without asking anything." Orin didn't speak after that. He just adjusted the mare's bridle and led her into the shaded stall behind the house. By evening, the sky had turned the color of smoked glass. Viretta stirred beans over the fire while Tahoma added dry wood. Across the clearing, Orin finished hammering a loose hinge on the tack shed. His sleeves were rolled higher now, and a thin band of soot streaked his forearm. He caught her eye once, briefly, then turned back to his work. Later, after Tahoma had gone to bed, Viretta stayed by the fire. She didn't expect company, but Orin came to sit beside her, pouring 2 tin cups of coffee from the pot. "I've got a brother up in Prescott," he said, handing her one. "Runs a freight line along the Verd. He never liked it down here, too quiet for him." She sipped carefully. "Why'd you stay?" "Quiet's what I needed," he said. "I lost a woman once, before the war. She drowned crossing the Washita. I went off to fight and came back to nothing." She watched him, but didn't speak. "Took me years to stop listening for her voice," he added. "Some days I still do." The fire cracked low between them. "I'm sorry," she said. He shook his head once. "I'm not telling you for pity, just so you know I understand the way grief settles in the bones." She looked down at her hands. It doesn't stop hurting. No, he said, but it stops being the only thing you feel. They sat in silence after that, not heavy, just still. The wind had settled and the coyotes were quiet tonight. Before she rose, she turned toward him. Thank you for letting us stay. You're not just staying, he said. You're welcome. She nodded, then walked toward the bunkhouse. Her footsteps were slow, not from weariness, but from something else, something growing inside. Tahoma lay awake on the cot, eyes open to the dark. You spoke with him, he said. She sat on the edge of her own bed. We shared coffee. He didn't answer. I won't walk where I'm not wanted, she said quietly. And I won't pretend this is what we used to be. He turned his head toward her, the lines of his face drawn with quiet acceptance. We were what we needed to be, for a time. She nodded once, then lay back, staring at the ceiling until sleep came soft and slow. In the morning, Orin was already saddling his horse. He looked up when she stepped outside, hair braided, hands clean, face unreadable. Ride with me, he said. I need to check the southern fence line. She hesitated, then nodded. They rode without speaking for a long stretch, the horses moving steady through the chaparral. Fence posts leaned in the sand like tired men, and the wire sagged in places. They reached the far ridge just before noon. Orin dismounted, crouched by a broken post, and began resetting it. Viretta joined him, holding the nail pouch, her fingers brushing his once by accident. He looked at her, not startled, just still. I thought I'd forgotten how to want someone, she said. Orin didn't move. You haven't forgotten. You just haven't had reason to remember. She stepped back slightly, heart loud in her chest. I didn't come here looking for this. I know, he said. That's why it matters. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something shifted between them like the earth bedding down after a long storm. They rode back slowly, and when they reached the ranch gate, he reached out and touched her reins gently. You're not alone anymore, Viretta, not unless you want to be. She looked at him, the ache in her chest no longer sharp, just deep. I don't, she said. And for the first time in years, the word felt like a beginning. By mid-September, the monsoon clouds had drifted north, leaving the air dry and brittle. The sky stretched wide and pale above the high desert. Viretta had taken to working the lower pasture with Orin, mending where the mule deer had torn through the fencing, digging out stubborn mesquite roots that threatened the new grazing plots. Tahoma, now walking without strain, spent most of his time carving thin strips of cottonwood shaped into delicate figures, each one different, none of them named. One morning, Orin found her near the sheep pen, sleeves damp to the elbows, hands buried in wool as she sheared one of the older ewes. Her brow was furrowed, jaw tight with focus. He waited until she finished the cut, then stepped closer. I've got to ride out to the north ridge, he said. Found tracks near the water hole yesterday. Might be rustlers scouting. She straightened. Want company, he hesitated. I do. But it could turn hard. I've known hard, she said. Let me saddle a horse. They rode north, the silence between them not hollow, just spare. Viretta's eyes scanned the ground as they followed the faint trail, hoofprints turned soft by wind and time. When they reached a narrow bluff overlooking the basin, Orin dismounted and crouched low, studying the bent reeds by the water's edge. Whoever it was, they didn't stay long, he said. She swung down beside him. Could be someone hungry, or someone planning to come back. They followed the edge of the bluff, circling wide back toward the ranch. As they rode, Orin glanced over. You ever think of leaving Arizona? She looked toward the horizon where the mountains blurred in heat. I used to. After Isaac died, it felt like the land itself had turned on me, but I stayed because I didn't know how not to. And now, she didn't answer right away. Now I think maybe I stayed because I was waiting for something I couldn't name. He slowed his horse, letting the words settle. You didn't wait in vain. Their eyes met, and there was no need to say more. Not now. When they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping behind the western ridge. Tahoma stood by the corral, holding a finished carving in one hand, a woman kneeling, her face turned skyward. He handed it to Viretta. She's not waiting, he said. She's listening. She ran her thumb along the smooth curve of the figure's back. You're leaving? I am, he said. My uncle in Fort Apache sent word. He needs help with the winter hunt. She nodded, the air thick against her throat. When? Tomorrow. At dawn, they stood in silence, the carving warm in her palm. You were good to me, she said. You saved me, he replied, but we are not meant to walk the same road forever. She reached out and touched his shoulder just once, then turned and walked toward the barn, the carving pressed to her chest. That night, as the fire crackled low, Orin found her sitting alone behind the bunkhouse, the figure beside her in the grass. "He's going," she said, "I know. I don't feel shame for loving him," she said. "But I don't feel bound to him either, not anymore." Orin sat down beside her, close enough for his knee to brush hers. "Sometimes love teaches us how to carry ourselves better, even when it doesn't stay." She turned to him. "And what about the kind that's meant to stay?" His breath caught just once. "That kind doesn't come often. When it does, you don't let it go." She reached for his hand and he took it, rough palm curling around hers like it belonged there. "I want to build something here," she said. "Not just survive it." "So do I." A wind moved through the grass, lifting the scent of dry sage and wood smoke. The stars came out one by one, and they stayed there until the fire burned down to embers, anchored in the quiet promise of beginning again together. A frost had settled over the high desert by the time Viretta began sleeping in the main house. Orin didn't ask, and she didn't explain. One evening, after they'd finished supper, she simply stayed when he stoked the stove and latched the door against the cold. Her shawl hung beside his coat now. Her comb lay on the washstand. It was not a declaration. It was a quiet staying. Each morning came earlier, the sky slow to lighten. Orin rose first, always careful not to wake her, though she often opened her eyes when he stepped into his boots. She liked the sound of his movements before dawn, measured and sure, like he belonged to the land as much as the house did. They worked the fields in rhythm. She took to managing the pantry and the drying house, preserving apples and wild onions in vinegar for the coming winter. Orin expanded the chicken run. On the porch, he'd begun carving a cradle, shaping each curve with a patience that made her chest ache. One afternoon, while she was gathering corn husks to twist into kindling, a rider came up the trail, leading a wagon with a split wheel. He was lean, older than Orin, with a weathered look and a limp that slowed his dismount. "Name's Elijah Hart," he said, tipping his hat. "Came from over near Pinetop. Wheel gave out 2 miles back." Orin glanced at the horizon. "You ride alone, wife's ahead on foot." "She's carrying, couldn't wait in the sun." Viretta stepped forward. "We've got water inside, shade too." Elijah nodded and followed them to the porch. An hour later, his wife Miriam arrived on foot, cheeks streaked with dust, her hand pressed low against her belly. Viretta helped her inside without a word and laid her on the bed Orin had built with his own hands. Miriam labored through the night. Viretta stayed at her side, steady as rain. She hadn't delivered a child since her own, but her hands remembered how to fold cloth, how to soothe with murmurs instead of noise. At first light, the baby came, a boy, slick and red-faced, lungs strong enough to wake the chickens. Elijah wept quietly when Viretta placed the child in his arms. "Didn't think we'd make it," he whispered. "You did," she said. "And he's whole." They stayed 2 days before the wagon was mended. Miriam insisted on leaving a bundle of stitched linens as thanks. Viretta folded them carefully and stored them in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. After they rode off, Orin found her by the clothesline, hands red from scrubbing. "You never told me you'd done that before," he said. She wrung out a shirt. "I didn't know if I still could." He watched her for a long moment. "You want more children?" She met his eyes. "If they come, I want them here, with you." He stepped closer, slow and certain. "I want that too, with you." That night, he set a small, carved ring on the table beside her plate. It wasn't gold, just smooth pine, finished with beeswax and oil. She didn't need to ask. She slipped it on her finger and didn't take it off, not even when she washed the dishes. Weeks passed. Snow came early that year, blanketing the fields in silence. Orin taught her to mend harnesses, and she showed him how to braid rope from yucca fibers. They didn't speak much about the past anymore. It wasn't forgotten, only folded away. Tahoma sent word once, a small bundle of tobacco wrapped in hide. Viretta kept it in the drawer beside her comb. One morning, just after the new year, Orin brought in a cedar sapling from the edge of the arroyo and planted it near the porch. Viretta stood behind him, her hands resting against his back. "Why here?" she asked. He brushed soil over the roots. "Because it'll grow tall and straight. Like what we're building." She bent to press a palm into the earth. "Then let it take root." They stood together in the cold light, wind brushing their coats, and said nothing more. There was no need. Everything that mattered was already growing. The snow thawed slow that spring, first from the south-facing slopes, then from the shallow gullies where sunlight lingered longest. Meltwater trickled through the pasture, soaking the roots of the winter rye Orin had planted before the first frost. Viretta walked the fence line with a woven basket on her hip, collecting dry grasses for lining the henhouse. A kestrel wheeled above the cottonwoods, its cry sharp and quick, and she paused to watch its flight. She'd begun to carry her weight differently, and though Orin hadn't said it aloud, he watched her more closely now when she lifted the feed sacks or bent over the stove too long. Her waist no longer cinched easily. At night, he traced the new shape of her with steady hands, his thumb resting lightly at the curve where her belly had begun to rise. One evening, as dusk slipped in through the windows, she sat by the hearth sewing a new shirt from blue calico. Orin leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching the thread pull clean through the fabric in small, practiced stitches. "You always sew like that?" he asked. "Like what?" "Like it matters who wears it." She smiled faintly without looking up. "It always did." He stepped further into the room. "I was thinking about the north field. Could run irrigation from the creek if we dig a trench. We'd need to brace the banks," she said. "Cottonwood roots won't hold if there's another hard rain." "Then we'll brace it with stone." She set the shirt in her lap. "You say we like it's always been that way." He sat beside her. "It has, even before I knew it." She turned to face him, her eyes steady. "I used to think I'd always belonged to what came before, that nothing I built after would ever be mine." "You were wrong," he said. She nodded once, and that was all. In early May, a letter arrived from Isaac's mother, carried by a passing trader. The envelope was thin, the ink faded. Viretta read it alone beneath the juniper tree behind the house. When she returned inside, her hands were trembling, but her face was calm. "She says the children are asking for me." Orin looked up from the stove. "Do you want to bring them here?" "I do." "If there's space." He crossed to her, resting a hand against her arm. "There's more than space. There's a home." They traveled together the following week, Orin driving the wagon while Viretta sat close beside him, her palm resting against her belly. The route to Isaac's family was long and rough, the air dry through the northern passes. When they arrived, the children hesitated at first, uncertain, eyes flicking between Orin's face and their mother's. Viretta knelt without speaking, her arms open but not reaching. Her daughter, barely 7, stepped forward first, then her son, older by 2 years, followed. They leaned into her without words, and she held them both against her, burying her face in their hair. Orin stood a few paces back, his hat in hand, eyes lowered out of respect. Later, after supper was shared and the sun had dipped low, Viretta spoke with Isaac's mother beneath the porch awning. No anger remained in the older woman's face, only a tired acceptance shaped by seasons and losses. "You've changed," the woman said. "I had to," Viretta replied. "You're still their mother. That doesn't change." "No," she whispered. "It doesn't." They left the next morning, the children nestled between sacks of beans and bolts of cloth that Isaac's mother insisted they take. The road home wound slow, but there was laughter now in the wagon, and Orin taught the children how to count the ridges by the river for direction. Viretta watched him when he wasn't looking, her heart full in a way it never had been before. By midsummer, the cradle was finished and set near the hearth. The children slept in the loft above the kitchen, where the morning light warmed the floorboards. Orin built a small desk for Viretta to teach them letters, and she kept a jar of wild iris petals on the sill where the bees came in the heat of the day. They married in early August, under the cottonwoods, with only the children, Elijah and Miriam, and a neighbor couple from the canyon. Miriam brought fresh bread wrapped in linen. Elijah carved a small bench as a gift. Orin wore a clean white shirt. Viretta wore her hair plaited with a strip of blue ribbon that once belonged to her mother. After the vows, Orin knelt and looked each child in the eye. "This house is yours," he said. "Not just the walls, the love in it." Their son looked toward Viretta, then back to Orin. "You're our pa now, if you'll let me be," the boy nodded slowly. "I think we already did." Viretta reached for Orin's hand, and he held it tightly. That night, once the candles were out and the children asleep, Viretta sat by the window brushing her hair. Orin came and stood behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "We've come far," he said. "We're still coming," she replied. He leaned down and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I'll walk beside you all the way." The wind moved through the eaves. The stars hung low and bright. And in the quiet warmth of that room, with her husband behind her and her children safe above, Viretta knew she had not just survived her sorrow, she had transformed it. She was no longer waiting. She was home.